In the year of our Lord 1486, two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, completed a manuscript that would become one of the most influential and horrifying documents in human history. It was called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and it was not a work of theology or philosophy. It was an instruction manual, a cold, methodical guide for the identification, torture, and execution of those who were believed to have made a pact with the ultimate enemy of Christendom, the devil himself. Within its pages, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate realms. They were in constant, violent contact. Every miscarriage, every spoiled harvest, every unexplained illness was not an accident of nature. It was an act of war, a calculated strike by an invisible enemy that walked among the faithful, hidden in the form of an old woman, a midwife, a neighbor. This was not paranoia. This was doctrine. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a world at war, not the war of kings and knights that filled the songs of troubadours, but a far older and more terrible conflict, a cosmic struggle between the forces of heaven and the legions of hell. And the battlefield was not some distant plain of fire and brimstone. It was here. It was the village square, the forest path, the threshold of your own home. The air itself was thick with invisible combatants, angels and demons, locked in an eternal struggle for the soul of every man, woman, and child. This was the metaphysical architecture of the medieval mind, a worldview in which every shadow held a potential threat. Every misfortune was a potential curse, and every stranger might be an agent of the infernal. The modern world has largely abandoned this vision. Hive replaced it with the clean, bright certainty of science, the reassuring hum of rationalism. We no longer believe in demons. We do not carve protective sigils into our doorframes or bury iron beneath our thresholds. We have banished the old terrors to the realm of superstition, to the footnotes of history books, to the costumes of Halloween. But to dismiss these beliefs as mere ignorance is to misunderstand the profound and terrifying logic that gave them life. For the people of the Middle Ages, demons were not metaphors. They were not symbols of inner turmoil or psychological projection. They were real, physical, intelligent entities with names, hierarchies, and specific methods of attack. They could be seen, heard, and in the most horrifying cases, felt, and the Church, the sole keeper of divine knowledge and the ultimate authority on all matters spiritual, told you in exhaustive and chilling detail exactly what they looked like, how they operated, and why they wanted you. This was not a world of vague spiritual dread. It was a world of systematic demonology, a science of the damned. The scholars of the Church did not simply warn the faithful to beware of evil. They catalogued it. They created vast taxonomies of hell, intricate organizational charts that mapped the infernal legions with the same meticulous care that a botanist might catalogue the flora of a newly discovered continent. They gave the demons ranks and titles. They assigned them specific sins to tempt, specific torments to inflict. They described their appearances in vivid, grotesque detail, ensuring that any soul unfortunate enough to encounter one would recognize it instantly. And at the apex of this nightmare hierarchy, commanding legions beyond mortal comprehension, sat the great princes of hell, Lucifer, the light-bringer, the first and most beautiful of all angels, whose pride had cast him down; Beelzebub, the lord of flies, whose dominion was filth and decay; Asmodeus, the demon of lust, whose whispers could corrupt the most pious heart; and Mammon, the embodiment of greed, who offered the world in exchange for a soul. But these were not distant, abstract horrors, confined to the pages of scripture or the nightmares of monks. They were present, they were active, they were here. The evidence of their work was everywhere. A child born deformed was not the result of a tragic accident of nature. It was the mark of a demonic visitation, a sign that a mother had been cursed, or had made some terrible, unspeakable bargain. A sudden storm that destroyed a harvest was not the caprice of weather. It was the calculated malice of a demon who had been summoned by a witch to punish a village. A man who fell ill with no visible wound, who wasted away despite the efforts of physicians, was not suffering from disease. He was being consumed from within by an invisible predator, a demon that had been invited into his body through sin, through witchcraft, or through the simple and unavoidable fact of living in a fallen world. Duo. The medieval imagination did not create these demons out of nothing. It inherited them. The Christian understanding of evil was built upon the ruins of older, far more ancient belief systems. When the church spread across Europe, it did not erase the old gods and spirits. It transformed them. The pagan deities of the forest, the spirits of the hearth, the wild and unpredictable forces of nature that had been worshipped and feared for millennia, were not acknowledged as alternate faiths. They were rebranded. They were demons. The horned god of the hunt, revered by the Celts and the Germanic tribes, became the horned visage of Satan himself. The fairies of the hollow hills, once seen as dangerous but neutral beings, were recast as servants of hell, their gifts now seen as temptations, their bargains as soul-binding pacts. Hall warned, all, la, all, la, la. The old rituals, the charms, the offerings left at sacred springs and ancient stones, were now acts of devil worship. The church did not just conquer Europe, it demonized it. Sova. This process of theological colonization created a landscape saturated with danger. Every ancient grove, every standing stone, every crossroads became a potential gateway to hell. The old places of power, where the veil between worlds had always been thin, were now marked as sites of infernal activity. And the people who still practiced the old ways, the healers, the cunning folk, the wise women who knew the properties of herbs and the phases of the moon, were no longer seen as valuable members of the community. They were witches, they were heretics, they were in league with the devil, and they had to be destroyed. But to truly understand the terror that gripped medieval Europe, we must go beyond the grand theological pronouncements of bishops and the fevered writings of inquisitors. We must enter the lived experience of the common person. We must walk the muddy streets of a medieval village, where the stench of death and decay was a constant companion, where 1 in 3 children did not live to see their 5th birthday, where a bad harvest meant starvation, and starvation meant that the bodies of your neighbors would be stacked in the churchyard like cordwood. This was a world of constant, grinding suffering, and suffering demanded an explanation. It demanded a villain, and the church provided one. Sibor. The demon was the perfect scapegoat. It was invisible, and therefore impossible to disprove. It was malevolent, and therefore explained every tragedy, and most importantly, it was external. The demon was not your fault. It was not the result of your own ignorance or bad luck, or the simple, brutal indifference of nature. It was an attack. It was a targeted assault by an intelligent, malicious entity that hated you specifically because you were a Christian, because you were one of God's children, and because your suffering brought it pleasure. This was a worldview that transformed random chaos into cosmic warfare, and in doing so, it gave meaning to the meaningless. It gave the illusion of control. If the demon was the cause, then the demon could be fought, prayers could be said, exorcisms could be performed, witches could be burned, and order, blessed order, could be restored. The scholars of the medieval church were not content to simply acknowledge that demons existed. They needed to understand them, to categorize them, to impose the same divine order upon hell that they believed God had imposed upon heaven. And so, with the same intellectual rigor that Thomas Aquinas applied to the nature of the soul, or Augustine to the problem of evil. They constructed elaborate hierarchies of the damned. These were not idle speculations. They were battle plans, maps of the enemy's territory, and the detail with which they were crafted reveals just how real, how immediate, and how terrifying the demonic threat was believed to be. The earliest attempts at demonic classification mirrored the celestial hierarchies described by the pseudo-Dionysius, a 5th-century theologian, whose writings on the 9 choirs of angels became foundational to Christian mysticism. If heaven had its ordered ranks of seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, then hell, being a twisted reflection of divine perfection, must have its own structure. The demons were not random monsters spawned from the void. They were fallen angels. They had once stood in the presence of God, had sung his praises, had been shaped by divine light, and when they fell, they did not lose their intelligence, their power, or their memory of what they had once been. They retained their ranks, their knowledge, and their terrible purpose. In 1467, the Spanish theologian Alfonso de Spina compiled one of the earliest systematic classifications of demons. His work was not based on abstract theology, but on the accumulated folklore, superstition, and terror of the European countryside. De Spina identified distinct categories of infernal beings, each with its own methods and targets. There were the incubi and succubi, sexual predators that violated men and women in their sleep, stealing seed and corrupting the innocent. There were wandering armies of demons, vast legions that roamed the night, attacking isolated travelers and laying waste to entire regions. There were familiars, small demons that bonded with witches and served as their servants and spies. There were druids, creatures from Germanic folklore that sat on the chests of sleeping victims, crushing the breath from their lungs. And there were the cambions, the monstrous offspring born from the union of demon and human, creatures that were neither fully mortal nor fully infernal, but something far worse. De Spina's classification was chaotic, almost desperate in its attempts to impose order on the overwhelming variety of demonic manifestations reported across Europe. But it laid the groundwork for more refined systems. In 1589, the German bishop and theologian Peter Binsfeld created what would become one of the most influential demonic hierarchies. Binsfeld's genius was simplicity. He took the 7 deadly sins, the fundamental moral failures that led souls to damnation, and assigned each one a ruling demon. Lucifer presided over pride, the sin that had cast him from heaven. Mammon commanded avarice, the worship of wealth that turned men away from God. Asmodeus was the master of lechery, the sexual corruption that destroyed families and souls. Satan himself, ironically, not the highest-ranking demon in many classifications, ruled over anger, the rage that led to violence and murder. Beelzebub, the lord of flies, governed gluttony, the insatiable consumption that reduced man to beast. Leviathan commanded envy, the poison that turned neighbor against neighbor. And Belphegor ruled sloth, the spiritual laziness that made men too weak to resist temptation. 2. This was not mere theological abstraction. It was a practical guide. If you found yourself consumed by a particular sin, if you felt an unnatural pull toward a specific vice, you now knew exactly which demon was attacking you. You knew its name, you knew its rank. And armed with that knowledge, you could pray to the specific saint who opposed that demon, who had faced that temptation, and triumphed. The spiritual warfare of the medieval mind was not vague. It was strategic, methodical, and deeply personal. Séwan. But perhaps the most chilling classification came in 1613 from the French Dominican prior and inquisitor Sébastien Michelis. Michelis claimed that his hierarchy was not the product of scholarship or theological speculation. It was a confession, a testimony extracted during an exorcism. The demon Berith, speaking through the body of a possessed nun, had revealed to Hierarchies the true structure of hell, complete with names, ranks, and the specific sins each demon was assigned to cultivate. Whether one believes this account or not, the hierarchy that resulted was comprehensive, brutal, and terrifyingly specific. Sover, Beelzebub, according to Berith, was second only to Lucifer himself. He had been a prince of the seraphim, the highest order of angels, and his specialty was envy. He was the founder of Hell's Order of the Fly, and his temptations were subtle, insidious. He did not offer wealth or power. He simply whispered comparisons, planted the seeds of resentment, turned contentment into bitterness. His adversary, the saint whose example could resist his influence, was Francis of Assisi, the man who had owned nothing and desired nothing except the love of God. D. Leviathan, another prince of the seraphim, tempted men to heresy. His weapon was not force, but doubt. He planted questions, undermined faith, made the teachings of the church seem contradictory or absurd. He was the demon of intellectuals, of those who believed that reason alone could unlock the mysteries of existence. His adversary was Peter, Hive, the rock upon which Christ built his church, the simple fisherman who had denied his Lord 3 times and yet remained faithful. Sozer, Asmodeus, prince of the thrones, burned with desire. He was the demon of lust, of wantonness, of every sexual transgression that had ever been conceived. He was ancient, appearing in Jewish texts as the demon who tormented Sarah, killing her 7 husbands before they could consummate their marriages. In medieval demonology, he was the master of incubi and succubi, the architect of every rape, every adultery, every forbidden desire. His adversary was John the Baptist, who had lived in the desert, who had denied the flesh in all its forms, who had remained pure even unto death. The list continued, each demon more specific, more terrifying in its particularity. Berith himself, the demon who revealed this hierarchy, tempted men to murder and blasphemy. Astareth inspired laziness, and sloth, Varine, cultivated impatience. Gressel promoted impurity. Sunellan sowed hatred. There were demons for every conceivable human failing, every moment of weakness, every shadow that crossed the human heart, and each one had a name, a rank, and a purpose. They were not random tormentors. They were specialists, craftsmen of damnation, tsu. But the hierarchies were not just about categorization, they were about power. To know a demon's name was to have leverage over it. This was ancient magic, older than Christianity itself, rooted in the Jewish mystical tradition, and even further back into the sorceries of Egypt and Babylon. The practice of exorcism, which became one of the church's most powerful weapons against the infernal, relied entirely on this principle. The exorcist did not simply command the demon to leave in the name of God. He demanded that the demon identify itself. He forced it to speak its name, to reveal its rank, to confess its purpose. And once the name was known, once the demon had been forced to acknowledge its own identity, it could be bound, commanded, and cast out. Saw. This was the power and the terror of medieval demonology. It transformed the abstract horror of evil into something concrete, something that could be studied, understood, and potentially controlled. It gave the church and its representatives a monopoly on knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death, salvation and damnation. And it ensured that every peasant, every merchant, every noble knew that they were not safe. Not in their homes, not in their churches, not even in their own minds. Because the demons were everywhere, organized, intelligent, and infinitely patient. And they knew your name, even if you did not yet know theirs. Georgie. The theoretical classifications were one thing, the lived terror was another. For every carefully reasoned theological treatise, there were 1,000 desperate accounts of actual encounters with the demonic, and the most visceral, the most intimate, and the most horrifying of these manifestations was demonic possession. This was not a demon that lurked in the shadows or whispered temptations from a distance. This was a demon that invaded the body itself, that took control of flesh and bone, that spoke through human lips and looked out through human eyes. To be possessed was to become a prisoner in your own skin, to feel your body move and speak without your consent, to witness your own hands perform acts of violence or blasphemy while you screamed silently inside. It was the ultimate violation, the complete annihilation of the self. To your J. The symptoms of possession were catalogued with the same meticulous care as the hierarchies of hell. The possessed exhibited violent, unnatural movements, their bodies contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. They spoke in languages they had never learned, their voices dropping to guttural growls or rising to inhuman shrieks. They displayed knowledge of events and secrets they could not possibly have known, revealing the private sins of those around them with malicious glee. They recoiled from holy objects, from blessed water, from the very name of Christ. Their faces changed, twisted into expressions of pure malevolence that bore no resemblance to the person who had once inhabited that body, and they were strong, impossibly, terrifyingly strong. Women who could barely lift a cooking pot would throw grown men across rooms. Children would require multiple adults to restrain them. The demon did not just occupy the body, it transformed it, weaponized it, turned it into an instrument of chaos and destruction. But possession was not the only form of direct demonic assault on the body. There was also obsession, a state in which the demon did not fully enter the victim, but instead tormented them from the outside, influencing their thoughts and dreams without taking complete control. The obsessed experienced nightmares of unimaginable horror, visions that left them screaming and drenched in sweat. They heard voices, constant whispers that urged them toward violence, toward sin, toward despair. They felt presences, cold hands on their skin, breath on the back of their necks, the sensation of being watched even when they were alone. This was psychological warfare, a slow erosion of sanity designed to break the victim's will and prepare them for full possession, or, worse, for the voluntary surrender of their soul through a demonic pact. And then there were the incubi and succubi, perhaps the most intimate and disturbing demons in the medieval imagination. These were not grand princes of hell commanding legions. They were predators, sexual parasites that stalked their victims in the vulnerable hours of sleep. The incubus, appearing as a man of terrible beauty or grotesque horror, depending on the account, would visit women in the night. The victims would wake to find themselves paralyzed, unable to move or cry out, while the demon pressed down upon them. Some accounts described a crushing weight on the chest, a suffocating presence that made breathing impossible. Others spoke of violation, of forced intercourse that left physical marks, bruises, and scratches that could not be explained. And from these unions, it was believed monstrous offspring could be born. Children who were deformed, who were touched by the infernal, who carried the taint of hell in their very blood. Diwa, the succubus, the female counterpart, was equally horrifying in her own way. She appeared to men, taking the form of the object of their desire, the woman they secretly longed for, the temptation they struggled to resist. She drained their vitality, their life force, leaving them weak, exhausted, and consumed by guilt. Medieval theologians debated the mechanics of these encounters with disturbing precision. How could a demon, a being of pure spirit, engage in physical intercourse? The answer, as proposed by Thomas Aquinas and others, was both ingenious and revolting. The demon would first take the form of a succubus, collecting the seed of a man. Then, preserving this seed, It would transform into an incubus and use that same seed to impregnate a woman. The demon itself was neither male nor female, but could assume either form as needed. The child born of such a union was not the biological offspring of the demon, but it was still tainted, still cursed, because the seed had passed through infernal hands and carried with it the corruption of hell. These were not rare occurrences. They were epidemic. Accounts of incubus and succubus attacks flooded the records of the medieval church. Women who became pregnant outside of marriage, who could not or would not name the father, might claim demonic visitation, and the church often accepted this explanation. It was preferable to accuse a demon than to admit to adultery or rape by a human perpetrator. And for men who experienced nocturnal emissions or erotic dreams, the succubus provided a convenient scapegoat, a way to externalize desire and avoid responsibility for their own thoughts. But the church took these claims seriously. The incubus and succubus were not metaphors for sexual anxiety or psychological repression, though they certainly embodied both. They were real threats, catalogued in demonological texts, discussed in councils, and addressed in sermons. To fall victim to one was not a sign of moral weakness. It was an assault, an attack by an enemy that could not be fought with physical weapons. The most terrifying aspect of demonic possession and obsession was its randomness. Anyone could be targeted. The pious and the sinner, the young and the old, the wealthy and the poor. The demon did not discriminate. In fact, the more devout you were, the more likely you were to become a target, because the demons delighted in corrupting the faithful, in dragging down those who had stood closest to God. Possession was often interpreted as a test, a trial sent by God to prove the strength of one's faith. The possessed were not necessarily guilty of sin, all they were victims, and their suffering was a battlefield upon which the eternal war between heaven and hell was fought in the most intimate and brutal way imaginable. All day, in said and ever others, tros, all day, one amoa. The church's response to possession was exorcism, a ritual of staggering power and danger. The exorcist, armed with holy water, blessed oil, and the authority of Christ himself, would confront the demon directly. He would command it to reveal its name, its purpose, its master. He would recite prayers, invoke the names of saints, brandish the crucifix as a weapon, and the demon would resist. Odix, it would scream obscenities, threaten the exorcist and his family, spit and vomit and thrash. Exorcisms could last hours, days, even weeks. The possessed body would be pushed to the edge of endurance and beyond. Bones would break, skin would tear, and sometimes the demon would not leave. Sometimes it would remain, claiming victory, and the victim would be abandoned to their fate, locked away in a monastery, or simply left to die. The exorcist himself was in constant danger, not just of physical harm, but of spiritual contamination. To stare into the face of a demon, to hear its voice, to wrestle with it in the spiritual realm, was to risk one's own soul. But for all the horror, for all the violence and suffering, exorcism was also a demonstration of power. When it succeeded, when the demon was cast out and the victim restored, it was proof that the church had dominion over hell itself. It was a public spectacle, a theater of redemption, that reinforced the authority of the clergy and the reality of the spiritual world. The demon was not just an enemy, it was a prop, a necessary villain in a cosmic drama that justified the church's existence and its control over the lives of the faithful. And the people watched, and they believed, because they had seen with their own eyes the contorted faces, heard the inhuman voices, witnessed the impossible strength. They had no other framework, no other explanation. The demon was real, the possession was real, and only the church could save them. If possession was the involuntary invasion of the body by demonic forces, then witchcraft was its willing counterpart. The witch was not a victim. The witch was a collaborator, a traitor to humanity who had made a conscious, deliberate choice to align herself with hell. And at the center of this betrayal was the pact, the demonic covenant, the single most damning act a human soul could commit. To make a pact with the devil was to reject God completely, to renounce salvation, to sell one's immortal soul in exchange for temporary power. And the church believed that this was not a rare occurrence. It was happening everywhere, in every village, in every city, hidden behind the faces of neighbors and friends. Zawada. The pact took many forms, but the most binding was the explicit pact, a formal contract signed in blood. The initiate, often lured by promises of wealth, revenge, or forbidden knowledge, would meet the devil or one of his agents at a crossroads, in a forest clearing, or in the ruins of an old church. The demon would present a document, written in Latin, or in an arcane script, that the witch might not even be able to read. The terms were simple. The witch would serve the devil, obey his commands, perform acts of maleficium, harmful magic, directed against the faithful. In exchange, she would receive power, protection, and the ability to command lesser demons as familiars. But there was always a clause, always a deadline. At the end of a specified period, usually 7 years, the soul would be forfeit. The devil would come to collect, and the witch would be dragged, screaming into hell for all eternity. Tuaja. The signing of the pact was a blasphemous parody of Christian sacrament. The witch would prick her finger, or open a vein, and use her own blood as ink. She would sign her name, or, if she could not write, make her mark, sealing the contract with the most intimate and irreplaceable substance she possessed. Some accounts describe the devil biting the witch, leaving a mark on her body that could never be healed, a permanent brand that identified her as property of hell. This was the devil's mark, the signum diaboli, and it became one of the primary pieces of evidence sought by witch hunters. The mark was said to be insensitive to pain, so suspects would be stripped naked and methodically pricked with needles over every inch of their bodies. If a spot was found that did not bleed or cause the victim to cry out, it was proof of the pact. It was proof of guilt. In Joel, or Zer. But the pact was only the beginning. The witch was now part of something larger, something more organized and more terrifying than any earthly conspiracy. She was a member of the devil's army, and like any army, it required training, coordination, and regular assembly. This was the purpose of the witch's Sabbat, the nightmare gathering that became the centerpiece of European witch-hunting hysteria. The Sabbat was not a metaphor. It was described in exhaustive, horrifying detail by thousands of accused witches, extracted through torture, written down by inquisitors, and accepted as absolute truth by courts across the continent. The journey to the Sabbat began with flight. The witch would anoint herself with a special unguent, a foul mixture made from the rendered fat of murdered infants, mixed with poisonous herbs and desecrated sacramental oils. She would rub this paste on her body, or on a broomstick, a pitchfork, or a wooden staff. Then, uttering a blasphemous incantation, she would be lifted into the air and carried through the night sky at impossible speeds. Some accounts described witches riding on the backs of demons who had taken the form of goats or black cats. Others spoke of transformation, of the witch herself shapeshifting into a bird or a bat. The flight was ecstatic, intoxicating, a liberation from the constraints of the physical world. But it was also a violation of natural law, a perversion of God's order, and it marked the witch as fundamentally other, fundamentally inhuman. Siwa. The Sabbat itself took place in remote locations, on mountaintops, in deep forests, in the ruins of pagan temples, The time was always midnight, the threshold hour, the moment when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. Upon arrival, the witch would find herself among dozens, sometimes hundreds of other witches, all gathered in a great circle around a fire, and at the center, presiding over the assembly, like a king over his court, sat the devil himself. In most accounts, he appeared as an enormous black goat, standing upright on his hind legs, his eyes glowing with infernal light, his phallus perpetually erect and grotesquely oversized. This was not a subtle symbol. This was the Antichrist, the inversion of all that was holy, the embodiment of bestial lust and primal chaos. Siwa. The ritual began with homage. Each witch would approach the devil and kiss his posterior in a gesture of absolute submission and degradation. This was the osculum infame, the shameful kiss, and it was a deliberate mockery of the kiss of peace exchanged among Christians. During Mass, new initiates would be presented, their pacts finalized through sexual intercourse with the devil himself. These unions were universally described as painful, horrifying experiences. The devil's member was said to be ice cold, scaled like a serpent, and the act was not one of pleasure, but of violation, a physical branding of the soul. Once the initiation was complete, the devil would assign each witch a familiar, a small demon in the form of a cat, a toad, a bird, or a rat, to serve her and feed on her blood through a hidden teat somewhere on her body. Sordiju. Then came the feast, a grotesque banquet of food that looked sumptuous but tasted of ash and rot. Roasted infants, sacramental bread stolen from churches and defiled with excrement, wine mixed with menstrual blood, and the rendered fat of hanged criminals. The witches ate and drank, and the food sustained them, but brought no pleasure, only a gnawing emptiness that could never be filled. This was sustenance without grace, consumption without satisfaction, another mockery of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, transformed into a meal of corruption and death. Siri, and finally, the orgy. The Sabbat descended into indiscriminate sexual chaos. Witches copulated with demons, with each other, with animals. All boundaries were erased, all taboos violated. Incest, sodomy, bestiality. Every act that the church condemned was performed in plain sight, celebrated, encouraged. This was the ultimate inversion of divine order, the reduction of humanity to pure animalistic impulse, the complete abandonment of reason and morality. And through it all, the devil watched, pleased with the degradation of souls who had once been made in the image of God. Too odd. When morning approached, the Sabbat would end, or the witches would fly back to their homes, crawling into bed beside husbands who had not noticed their absence, resuming their roles as wives, mothers, healers. But they carried the mark of the Sabbat with them, the stain on their souls, the invisible corruption that could never be washed away. And they would return, week after week, compelled by the terms of their pact, slaves to the devil, until the day he came to collect his due, to do a Jafar. The question that haunts the modern mind is simple. Did any of this actually happen? Were there really witches flying through the night to meet the devil? Were there really Sabbats, pacts signed in blood, infants roasted and consumed? The answer, almost certainly, is no. The Sabbat as described in the witch trial records is a fantasy, a fever dream born of torture, leading questions, and the desperate desire of accused women to tell their interrogators whatever they wanted to hear to make the pain stop. The hallucinogenic properties of certain plants, ergot fungus on grain, the effects of sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation, all of these can explain the vivid, consistent testimonies without requiring the existence of actual demonic gatherings. Sobel. But to dismiss the Sabbat as mere superstition is to miss the deeper truth. The Sabbat was real in the medieval mind. It was real in the same way that demons were real, that hell was real, that the cosmic war between good and evil was real. It was a culturally constructed reality, a shared nightmare that shaped behavior, justified violence, and gave meaning to suffering. The witch was not just a criminal, she was the ultimate enemy, the traitor within, the cancer in the body of Christendom, and the only cure was fire. Soji, Soji. But the medieval imagination did not only create ways to serve demons, it also created ways to fight them. For every demon there was a saint. For every curse there was a blessing. For every act of maleficium there was a counter-ritual, a protective charm, an apotropaic symbol carved into wood or stone or scratched onto metal. The people of medieval Europe were not passive victims of demonic assault. They fought back with every tool at their disposal, both sacred and profane. The most powerful weapon was, of course, the church itself. The sacraments, particularly the Eucharist and baptism, were seen as impenetrable armor against demonic attack. Holy water, blessed by a priest and infused with the power of God, could drive away demons, purify corrupted spaces, and protect against possession. The sign of the cross, made with the right hand over the body, was a shield that could deflect curses and turn away evil spirits. The very name of Jesus, spoken aloud with faith and conviction, had the power to command demons and force them to obey. Jirwa, Bol, Simwa, the partum cease. But beyond the official rituals of the church, there existed a vast and complex world of folk magic, protective charms, and apotropaic practices that blended Christian symbolism with far older traditions. Doors and windows, the liminal spaces through which demons were believed to enter, were protected with iron nails, horseshoes, and carved symbols. The hexafoil, a six-petaled rosette, was scratched into wooden beams and stone lintels, its overlapping circles forming a trap in which demons would become lost, following the endless lines for eternity. The pentagram, far from being a symbol of devil worship, was a Christian protective mark representing the 5 wounds of Christ, a declaration that this space was claimed by God and off-limits to hell. Sealed witch bottles, sealed jars filled with pins, nails, urine, and sometimes the victim's hair or nail clippings, were buried beneath thresholds or hidden in chimneys to capture and torment any witch who attempted to curse the household. The theory was elegant. The witch's familiar, sent to deliver a curse, would be drawn into the bottle and trapped by the sharp objects within. The urine, carrying the essence of the intended victim, would burn and torment the familiar, causing the witch herself to experience agony and forcing her to withdraw her magic. Tiwa, herbs and plants, also played a crucial role in demonic defense. Rowan berries, hung above doorways, were believed to repel witches. St. John's wort, blessed on the feast of the saint, could drive away demons and protect against possession. Garlic, that ancient and universal ward against evil, was consumed, worn, and planted around homes. Even salt, that most common of substances, was seen as purifying and protective. Its ability to preserve food extended metaphorically to preserving the soul from corruption. Tsu. And then there were the names. Just as knowing the name of a demon gave the exorcist power over it, invoking the names of saints provided protection and aid. Every trade, every profession, every illness had its patron saint who could be called upon in times of need. Saint Christopher for travelers, Saint Agatha for protection against fire, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Anthony for lost objects. The list was extensive, exhaustive, a spiritual directory that ensured no crisis was too small or too specific to lack divine assistance. The saints were heaven's army, the counterforce to hell's legions, and they were just as real, just as present, as the demons they opposed. Tejum Soho. The demons of medieval Europe were not confined to theological texts and trial records. They were made visible, rendered in stone and paint and ink, given form by the hands of artists who believed absolutely in their reality. To walk through a medieval cathedral was to be surrounded by the demonic. Gargoyles leered from the rooftops, their grotesque faces frozen in eternal snarls, rain pouring from their open mouths like vomit. These were not decorative flourishes, they were warnings. They were reminders that the spiritual battle was constant, that demons watched from the shadows, that the boundary between the sacred interior and the corrupt world outside was fragile and required constant vigilance. Tuwaso, the gargoyle served a dual purpose, both practical and symbolic. Functionally, it channeled rainwater away from the stone walls, preventing erosion and structural damage. But symbolically, it was far more complex. Some theologians argued that the gargoyles were representations of demons themselves, placed on the exterior of the church to signify that evil had been cast out, banished from the holy space within. Others believed they were protective guardians, friendly spirits that used their monstrous appearances to frighten away more malevolent entities. But the most common interpretation was pedagogical. The gargoyles were lessons carved in stone, visual sermons that reminded the faithful of what awaited those who strayed from God's path. They depicted demons, yes, but also damned souls, humans transformed into monsters by their own sin, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies warped into hybrid forms that were neither fully human nor fully beast. Soji. Inside the cathedrals, on the walls and in illuminated manuscripts, demons appeared in even more elaborate detail. Medieval art did not shy away from the grotesque. It embraced it, reveled in it, used it to maximum effect. Demons were depicted with horns and wings, with claws and tails, with bodies covered in scales or fur or feathers, but they were also shown with disturbingly human features, faces that could be recognized, expressions of intelligence and malice that made them more terrifying than any mindless monster. They tormented the damned in carefully choreographed scenes of torture, dragging souls into hell, binding them in chains, roasting them over fires, dismembering them with surgical precision, and always, they were smiling, sirs. But no artist captured the medieval vision of hell and its inhabitants with more terrifying imagination than Hieronymus Bosch. Working in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, at the height of the witch-hunting hysteria, Bosch created paintings that remain disturbing even to the modern viewer, desensitized as we are to images of horror. His most famous work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, is a triptych that shows the progression from paradise to earth to hell, and it is the hell panel, the right wing of the triptych, that freezes the blood. Tejobinza. Bosch's hell is not an abstract concept. It is a landscape, a place, rendered with the same attention to detail that another artist might give to a pastoral scene. The sky burns with a sickly orange glow. Cities collapse in flames on the horizon, and in the foreground, demons torture the damned with creative, almost playful cruelty. A man is crucified on the strings of a harp, his body played like an instrument by a demon whose head is part bird, part musical notation. Gamblers are impaled on their own dice. Musicians are tormented by giant instruments that have become instruments of execution. A massive pair of ears, connected by a knife blade, march across the landscape like a war machine, crushing souls beneath them. And presiding over it all is the tree man, a figure whose body is a hollow shell containing a tavern, whose face stares out at the viewer with an expression of profound existential despair. Sure, same to me. What makes Bosch's demons so disturbing is not just their grotesqueness, but their hybridity. They are composites, assemblages of human, animal, plant, and mechanical parts that should not be able to exist, let alone function. They are violations of natural law, embodiments of chaos, living proof that hell is not just a place of punishment, but a place where reality itself breaks down. And yet, for all their strangeness, there is a horrible logic to them. Bosch drew on the folklore of his time, on the reported visions of mystics, and the fevered confessions of the possessed. His demons are the demons of the medieval imagination, made manifest, given form by an artist who may have been a genius, a madman, or possibly both. Modern art historians have offered various explanations for Bosch's visions. Some point to ergot poisoning, the same fungus that contaminated grain and caused hallucinations, that turned bread into a psychedelic drug and may have fueled the witch trials themselves. Others suggest that Bosch was a member of heretical sects, that his paintings contained coded messages, critiques of the church disguised as religious art. Still others argue that he was simply an exceptionally imaginative artist, working within the conventions of his time, taking the established iconography of hell and pushing it to its logical, nightmarish conclusion. But regardless of the source of his inspiration, Bosch succeeded in creating images that transcended their time. His demons are not medieval curiosities on their archetypes, tapping into fears that are universal and timeless. The fear of losing control of one's own body, the fear of pain without end, the fear of being reduced to an object, a thing to be used and discarded, the fear that suffering has no meaning, that it serves no purpose except the amusement of those who inflict it. These are not just medieval fears, they are human fears. And that is why Bosch's hell still has the power to disturb us. 5 centuries after it was painted. The medieval belief in demons did not end with the Middle Ages. It evolved, transformed, adapted to new cultural contexts and new anxieties. The Protestant Reformation brought a renewed focus on demonic activity, as Catholics and Protestants accused each other of being in league with the devil. The witch trials intensified, reaching their horrifying peak in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Enlightenment attempted to banish demons through reason, to replace supernatural explanations with scientific ones. But the demons did not disappear. They simply moved from theology to psychology, from exorcism to psychiatry, from demonic possession to multiple personality disorder, to schizophrenia, to dissociative identity disorder. The language changed, the framework changed, but the experience, the phenomenon of a self that is fractured, invaded, controlled by something other, remained. In the modern secular world, we no longer believe in literal demons with names and ranks, and the ability to sign contracts in blood, but we have our own demons: addiction, trauma, depression, the voices that tell us we are worthless, the impulses we cannot control, the darkness that rises from within and threatens to consume us. We have replaced the exorcist with the therapist, holy water with medication, prayer with cognitive behavioral therapy. But the battle remains the same. It is a battle for the self, for autonomy, for the right to inhabit one's own mind and body, without invasion or corruption. The medieval demons were, in the end, a way of making sense of chaos. They were an explanation for suffering, a scapegoat for sin, a projection of internal struggles onto external entities that could be named, confronted, and potentially defeated. They were real because they needed to be real, because the alternative, that pain and evil simply exist without purpose or agency, was too unbearable to contemplate. And in that sense, the demons were not a failure of medieval imagination. They were a triumph of it. They were a refusal to accept meaninglessness, a determination to impose narrative and structure even onto the darkest aspects of human existence. We may no longer carve protective symbols into our doorframes or bury witch bottles beneath our thresholds. We may no longer attend exorcisms or report our neighbors as servants of Satan, but we have not escaped the demons. We have simply renamed them. And perhaps that is the final, most uncomfortable truth that medieval demonology reveals. The demons were never out there. They were always in here. They were, and are, and will always be, the shadow side of consciousness itself, the price we pay for being human. The medieval world understood this in its own language, through its own lens. We understand it in ours. But the terror, the struggle, the desperate need to believe that we can be saved remains exactly the same. To all,